Hey, it's Logan Henriquez, founder of Page.support. This video is a quick introduction to our new tool that allows anyone to build interactive documentation. The motivation for this tool is that there's many scenarios like customer support, product recommendations, and all sorts of professional services where humans converse to solve problems together. We want to enable anyone to scale that expertise to a larger audience through automation. While conversation is essential to so many human-to-human interactions, there aren't many tools that allow non-technical folks to automate conversational experiences. There are many tools for developing chatbots, but most of them require running software, integrating third-party servers, and take months to deliver something that works. Also, you've probably experienced that most chatbot implementations don't get much user engagement, and they don't really answer your questions well. A big part of this is that they're off to the side instead of integrated with your primary content. And also, because of the difficulty of authoring conversation with other tools, it's difficult to create a complete experience for the user. You can learn how to use Page.support in a few hours. It's simpler than learning a spreadsheet. It creates interactive documentation that could be integrated with your documentation, including the existing documentation, or your product setup flow. Page's web client, it runs in the user's browser, so there's no third-party server integration, and that allows you to achieve high standards of privacy and regulatory compliance. Next, let's take a look at the type of experience that you can build. So this is our homepage here. Under the product tab, there are a couple different use cases you can take a look at, and there's also one just down here. So let's go into the guide use case. This is super common in customer support scenarios. So in this particular case, we're going to do a demo of what a conversational experience might look like if you were an Apple customer trying to cancel a subscription on an Apple device. Now, these are the real directions that Apple gives you on their website. There's several pages of documentation around it, and there's also documentation on a per product basis. So this basically simplifies that interaction, doesn't require the user to do as much reading. So let's start by picking our device. So let's say the user's on a Mac. We're going to drill into it, and it's going to tell you each of the steps that you have to take through several different menus on the Mac. And these differ by product, so it's important to have these the product selection up front. So you're going to click on a bunch of different things. We can show the user images here, videos, as well as links to take them to the direct menu. For example, on mobile, on an iPhone, you can actually deep link to the exact menu right next to the dialogue and then have them perform the action. So after several more clicks, the user should be able to see their subscription and just click the cancel button. Now at this point, a good user experience would be to make sure that this actually worked for the user, because you want to be doing analytics to make sure that your automation is working. So let's say at this point we can ask the user, did this actually work for you? And if it didn't work for them, there's often various corner cases which Apple presents like this that you can drill down through and see if you can make it work. And of course, if that still doesn't work, contact Apple support should always be part of the experience. Now, if it did work for them, they would just click yes here, and you would simply thank them, and the experience is over. Next, let's talk about how you actually create conversational documentation with Page.support. Page.support uses Markdown as its authoring language. Check out www.markdownguide.org if you're not already familiar with it. Markdown is used by millions of documentation writers. It can be learned in about an hour. We've extended Markdown with RGML to drive the conversational logic. RGML was invented in the New York Times to enable non-technical editors to create dynamic experiences without writing code. And so that's very similar to our use case, so I decided to adopt it and integrate those two fairly standard ways of writing and publishing content. So let's go to the publisher now and actually build that interaction that we saw in the demo in the previous step. The publisher lets you input Markdown and RGML. the markdown is typed here, and you generally would create this in a different editor, just paste it in here, preferably use some version control if you want to collaborate around it and iterate with versions. And then on the right hand side here you see the emulator, which takes the HTML notation and makes the whole experience dynamic. So what I've done here is I've typed in some boilerplate at the top. What this does is it names your interaction, it provides some context to the user, and it also allows some routing in the case where you have multiple bots and you need to do SEO. The really interesting part is this right here. This is an HTML comment, and inside we see some key value pairs. So the key here, this say.name piece, is naming the particular question that we're asking here. We're asking the user what type of device they're going to try and cancel the subscription on. And then the user's answer is going to actually be stored in a variable called device, which we can then refer to later when deciding how to continue the conversation. This type key here is called single, and this says that we are accepting a single response from the user. There's a variety of different types here, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then the reply section here is basically setting up, telling the interpreter to accept these 3 replies from the user. One of the key differences between Page.support and your typical chatbot is we don't, at least in this version, accept free text entry. And the reason for that is because it's much easier to get the matching of the user's answer to an intent correct with this type of selection. And free text is much harder to get right, and the fact that a lot of chatbots don't get it right is the cause of a lot of user frustration in that department. So when we run this, what happens? We basically see that the markdown parts of the text, this section up here, is rendered at the top, and we also see that the question itself down here was rendered here. And then it set up a single response question option that I can then pick from, and there's nothing more because I haven't put anything else in the conversation. Next, let's talk about triggers. An interactive document will ask the user several questions to understand their goal or their problem. What's different than a standard form is that the questions that are asked are going to be dynamic. The answers that the user gives determines which questions are asked next. This requires using triggers that determine when a particular tag is run. For example, before we saw that each Apple device in the cancellation flow has a unique set of menus the user needs to go through. So we want to know which device they're on before we start walking them through that flow. So let's actually build that part of the interaction out with a trigger. I'm going to copy some trigger text into the same file that we had before, and we see something new here. Inside the comment tag, there are 2 new types of keys. There's a trigger key and there's a type key. So the trigger key is followed by an expression. In this case, it's a formula, and the formula basically says if the user's answer to the device question that was asked before is the first answer in the list that we showed before, and the list we showed before was right here, and so the first answer is the iPhone and iPad. If those 2 are the same, then run this interaction. And if this is true, it's going to run the next interaction. If it's false, it's just going to skip it. It's going to go to the next one and evaluate the trigger for that one to see if that's the one to run. The other thing that's new here is the type key. And this type is a diagnostic. And this is basically a shorthand for a very common pattern that's used in many different scenarios to walk the user through a set of steps sequentially. This simplifies the process of building interactions like this because you only need to give it a list. It has to be a numbered list, and then you give it text, images, whatever you're going to show the user in each step. You don't need an extra comment tag for each one of them. These are the types of simplifications that really increase the speed of building interactions like this because they're so standard. So let's run this and see what happens. So we see the question that we saw before, where it asked me what device. I'm going to pick iPhone because that's the only part that we've built so far. And now it's going to start walking me through each step. It's going to ask me to perform the step and then come back here and say I'm done. I open settings, I tap my name, and now I'm going to see a subscription link in the UI. I'm going to click that. I'm going to find the subscription I want to cancel. I'll tap the cancel button, and that's it. I'm done. Goal-driven human conversation fits into a small number of patterns. Most goal-driven interactions fit into one of search, requests, recommendations, or guiding or diagnostics. Search and requests are generally pretty well automated with forms, so we don't actually build for that in Page.support. There's lots of technologies that do that. It's recommendations and guiding where we focus, because that's where conversation really adds value. Rather than expecting bot creators to design each pattern from scratch, Page.support lets you pick one of those patterns and then add its unique logic. We just saw the guide or diagnostics pattern in action. And there's several others on the website. You can also try out the Getting Started experience in the publisher for a good example. So you may be wondering, hey, interactivity is nice, but is it really necessary? The user could just search for directions on the right device and read it. And some users will. However, when you have a lot of documentation, which is true of almost every company that sells something technical, and when there are many steps that vary based on the user's problem or goal, finding the right instructions often isn't easy for users. When it's not easy, users call support, they get frustrated, and they generally will avoid reading anything that's longer than about a page. Another issue is that in complex domains where expertise is needed to figure out what to do, there's lots of examples like this, like technical support, medicine, law, etc. Users don't know what the right questions to ask are. And so they also don't know what to search for to get the right directions. They only understand their problem. So Page.support lets you use triggers like we saw before to leverage your expertise to craft the right set of questions, collect the right information, and then guide the user to an answer that works for their particular problem. So for those domains where users depend on human experts, we have something called a recommendations pattern. Let's take a look at what that looks like next. So with recommendations, you want to give the user a recommendation at the end of a dialogue, dialogue meaning a set of questions and answers. And so we have something called the answer pattern for this and a tag specifically to that. Answers are usually the last thing that happens in a dialogue, and you have a collection of different answers that are going to be given to the user based on what they told you up until that point. So let's give a quick demonstration of an example of that. So here's an example of a recommendation-driven flow. This is, imagine you are on a travel site and you're interested in going to Italy, taking maybe a week and spending time in the Amalfi Coast. And one of the features of the Amalfi Coast is there are dozens and dozens of towns, there are many different types of experiences, different things to do, many price points, etc. So imagine this is a dialogue that you might have with someone who's familiar with the area to help you pick what you want to do and where you want to go. And one of the key things everyone needs to figure out is which of the many towns in that area they're going to stay at. So this is kind of like an interactive travel agent that could complement a travel site. This same sort of flow could complement any sort of site, whether you're talking about product recommendations, travel recommendations, a medical diagnostic, anything really. So there's two sections here. There's a section up here with some images and some server-side rendered text. This helps your page get the SEO it needs. But then there's a dynamic section below where you explain some options to the user and ask for their preferences. So the first question here is, what activities do they want to do? And it's showing some images and some links to websites that give them more information on these specific activities. So this, for example, is Google Maps, which shows you the Path of the Gods, which is one of the popular hiking areas. Now, if we go back to this, there's also boating and swimming, and the text there provides you some information about how you can rent boats, what restaurants you can go to with boats, shopping and dining, and so on. So the first question is the user selects which activities they want to do. And this is a multi-select, right? You might want to have some gourmet meals, you might want to go swimming, and so on. So let's just pick boating and swimming and see what happens. So we're done with that. The next question is, how long will you be staying on the Amalfi Coast? Well, let's say we're just going to stay for 2 days. And then, what type of experience do you want? Do you want something crowded? Do you want something peaceful? And we make a selection there. Let's say we want something that's moderately crowded. And we have a budget, different options. We pick our budget. And so great. The triggers that we set up select a town to recommend to the user amongst, there's a very long list. I think in the Amalfi Coast is probably 30, 40 towns. So in this case, it's said, hey, this is a great town for you based on those criteria, tells you a little bit about it, gives you some links to allow you to investigate more. Okay, well, let's take a look at what the markup for that particular interaction looks like. So in each of our examples, we have a link to the actual markdown, and there is a directory in GitHub called Page.support/example bots, and you'll see a bunch of different examples here. But the interaction that we just went through is basically this file. And what you see is there's several questions, and then there are some fairly lengthy triggers for each of the different towns that it recommends. So what we were looking at just a moment ago was this particular trigger. You can see there were 4 different questions, and there is a formula for each of those questions, which gets triggered in a particular subset of the answers that the user may have given. And each of the towns, whether it's Positano, Sorrento, and so on, have a different set of triggers. So basically, it's going to walk through each of these until it finds a trigger that is true, and then it's going to display that one to the user. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. And if you want more information, check out our homepage, Page.support. Lots of information here about what differentiates the solution, and at the bottom, a set of steps to start using the publisher. Check out our documentation, and if you have any questions, join our group. Thanks for watching.